Welcome to DC Insiders, where we bring you sharp views about global issues with relevance to Taiwan from the political capital of the world here in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Wenchi Yu. President Trump and President Xi finally met in person in South Korea on the margins of the APEC summit. According to both sides, the Taiwan issue didn't even come up. While Trump 2.0's policy toward Taiwan remains largely consistent, there have been reports of tactical shifts related to Taiwan reflecting President Trump's trade and technology demands on China. Meanwhile, Taiwan's domestic political landscape is evolving with significant developments, including the failed recall elections this summer, the election of a new KMT party chair, and ongoing U.S.-Taiwan trade negotiations. These factors contribute to a shifting geopolitical environment in the Indo-Pacific. Today, we're speaking with Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund. Welcome, Bonnie.
Thanks for having me.
So, according to U.S. and China readout, the Taiwan issue didn't come up during the APEC summit between Xi Jinping and President Trump. Is this unusual?
It is. I think that in most summit-level meetings, the Chinese side raises Taiwan. We certainly know that Xi Jinping raised Taiwan when he met with President Biden in the fall of 2023 and when they met in Bali the year before that. There had been a lot of media that had speculated that President Xi Jinping would, in fact, raise this with President Trump.
So why did you think that this wasn't even mentioned? Or it was mentioned, but neither side wanted to make it public?
I think it was probably not mentioned. And again, I can only speculate. We don't know. Maybe the Chinese are somewhat less concerned about U.S. policy toward Taiwan because over the last few months, we have seen the Trump administration make some decisions that seem to prioritize Beijing's interests or maybe put off some of the things that they were doing with Taiwan. The meeting was only about 1 hour and 45 minutes. Maybe they just ran out of time, but it does look like the two leaders will meet next year, maybe in April. And I wouldn't be surprised if Taiwan is raised then.
It's interesting because after the summit, just during the 60 Minutes interview, President Trump was asked what he would do if China makes a move on Taiwan. And President Trump said, it's a secret. Is the U.S. back to strategic ambiguity? You know, what is the Trump's policy on Taiwan?
In my view, the United States never changed its policy of strategic ambiguity, although I would caveat that by saying that there is no U.S. document that says that our policy is strategic ambiguity. The United States just has not made clear since it established diplomatic ties with the People's Republic of China in 1979 whether or not it would come to Taiwan's defense, because of course, before that, we had a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan. So we left it ambiguous, and that was interpreted by people outside government as a policy of strategic ambiguity. So that's my interpretation. But I think it is very interesting that President Trump is reluctant to say anything about whether or not the United States would defend Taiwan. However, he continues to say that Xi Jinping knows what he would do. He knows what the consequences would be. And then he claims that Xi Jinping has told him that as long as you're president, Donald Trump, I will not attack Taiwan, as long as you're in control.
But do you think the Chinese side actually said something to him that they would not attack Taiwan when he's the president?
I highly doubt it. I don't think that anybody in China's leadership would say that as long as President Trump holds the presidency in the United States, that China will not use force against Taiwan. China has never taken force off the table. They haven't done so temporarily or for a longer period of time. I think this is just President Trump trying to shape the narrative and shape the conversation.
Yeah. What's also interesting was right after the summit, we saw that Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, also tweeted that the relationship between the United States and China has never been better. And as President said, in his historic G2 summit, that has set the tone for everlasting peace and success for the US and China. And the Department of War will do the same. So peace through strength, mutual respect, and positive relations. What does that mean? Does that mean the Pentagon is changing its Indo-Pacific policy?
Well, if you paid attention to what Secretary Hegseth said when he was in the region, and of course he was in Malaysia, Vietnam.
When was that?
Around the same time that the president was. Yeah. So he had many meetings with our allies. He went to the TaiwanPlus meeting, and he met with many of his counterparts throughout the region. And he signed some agreements. He talked about the threat from China. It sounded very much like a traditional U.S. approach to the Indo-Pacific. There was a lot of continuity, I would say.
We share concerns about China's coercion in the South China Sea, particularly recently in Scarborough Shoal. It bears repeating that mutual defense treaty is critical for both of our countries. Either of our forces anywhere in the South China Sea, it is applicable. And we don't seek confrontation, but of course we're ready to protect our interests, individually and mutually. And that's why we're publicly announcing the Task Force Philippines here with you today, which will be another step in our cooperation, increasing interoperability, exercising, and preparedness for contingencies, so that we can decisively respond to crisis or aggression and reestablish deterrence in the South China Sea.
And I think that Hegseth saw what the president posted on his social media about G2 and the fantastic relationship between the US and China. And I think he felt that he had to maybe tack back a little bit, so that his messaging sounded very similar to that of President Trump. But his messaging in the region has been quite different.
So that's really interesting for anyone who's trying to understand the US policy towards China or Asia. Right, you have the president who sets the tone pretty much, and others have to follow. But in terms of the substance, it doesn't seem to have changed as much. And how does someone read this?
Well, but I actually think that you have hit the nail on the head, that there is no clear strategy from the Trump administration.
So you don't think there's a very clear strategy?
I do not. I think that President Trump came into the meeting with Xi Jinping wanting some specific things. He got most of what he wanted, but if he hadn't imposed very high tariffs on China to begin with, then maybe we wouldn't have had the problems that he had to fix, like China not buying soybeans from the United States, or China not providing rare earth material and magnets and other critical minerals to the United States. So these weren't problems in the Biden administration, frankly. So he created problems with his tariffs, and now he has addressed them. Maybe we have a fragile truce, but it's not clear to me what kind of relationship he wants with China. I'm just guessing. He's very difficult to read, and I think that there really isn't a clear strategy. And if we go back to the Biden administration, you will remember that there was a strategy which they labeled invest, align, and compete. So there was a very clear set of objectives that the United States was trying to achieve. Some of them, at least the first, is similar to President Trump. Investing in America, making the United States stronger. And remember that when Biden became president, that the Chinese really believed that the United States was in inexorable decline. And so it was felt that it was essential to build up the strength of the United States. The allies portion, very different in the Trump administration. And I'm still not sure in what ways this administration is trying to compete with China and to what end, other than to win.
Now let's turn to China, right? China's just concluded the fourth plenum and in late October. And Taiwan was actually mentioned in its communique. Of course, it's in the context of national reunification. And then what's interesting was that CCP also appropriates October 25th as what they call the Taiwan's Retrocession holiday. What do you think that means? Does it mean they're ready to do something, or it's more symbolic?
Well, I think those are two very different questions. The statement at the fourth plenum, in my view, was not very different from prior statements we have heard from Beijing for over a decade. Peaceful development of cross-strait relations, I think, was the policy developed under Hu Jintao. And I always suggest to people to compare what is said today to what was said in prior years and even under prior leaders. The objective of reunification we know has existed for a very long time.
Yeah.
So I don't see any fundamental change in the objective. The question that's, of course, interesting to ask is there greater urgency? Are there different tactics and policies that are being used to advance that objective? And the Taiwan Retrocession Day, I think, is yet another example of a tactic by China to interpret history in its own way, to tell the story that Taiwan is part of China, has always been part of China, was returned to China even when, because it was colonized by Japan, then returned to China. And so it is trying to tell the world the one China principle is set in stone and nobody should challenge it. Yeah. And this is a message, it is an important message for China domestically to tell its own people, but it's also a message for people in Taiwan.
Right.
Taiwanese people should just give up, should surrender, because they're already part of China. And recently, we have seen several articles that under a very authoritative pseudonym in the People's Daily that have been focusing on all the benefits that Beijing would give to the people in Taiwan if they just join the China.
Giving them incentives now.
Exactly. So it's always been carrots and sticks. The balance can change over time. But that's what I think that we're seeing now, is that the message, I think, has come down from the highest level in China that preventing Taiwan from declaring or becoming more independent, permanently separated from China is not sufficient. It's still necessary, but that China should be promoting unification, and it should be using more of its leverage to try and bring forward that day where Taiwan will ultimately be part of China, be reintegrated into the motherland, as they would say.
Yeah.
So is this a legacy issue for Xi Jinping? Some people say it is, that he wants to achieve this before he leaves office. I'm not convinced. That is a possibility, but I think he has so many other things on his plate, he doesn't get up every morning and think about Taiwan and reunification.
Now let's take a quick break. You're watching DC Insiders on TaiwanPlus. We will be back in a moment.
经历过人生的话，你发现说，我们大部分都是爱美的。
我自己少遇见一朵花，我可能就不是这个样子。
开始思考什么叫做一个本土性，
大声的唱出来说我是台湾人。
How does Taiwan stay on the forefront of innovation in a world of uncertain tariffs, wars, and shifting geopolitics? Get answers and more, from award-winning programs to exclusive Mandarin dramas. Download the TaiwanPlus app to any device today. No ads, no bias, just facts. TaiwanPlus.
Welcome back to DC Insiders. Today we're talking to Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of German Marshall Fund's Indo-Pacific Program, about Trump 2.0's Taiwan policy. Now, on Taiwan, there's been some changes as well, some interesting changes. So the KMT just elected a new party chairwoman, Zheng Li-wen. Do you think it's going to change how Taiwan or KMT approach to Beijing, of course, Taiwan, and Washington, D.C.?
Well, it's very early days, so we don't know. I've been reading a little bit about Zheng Li-wen's, her interviews, things that she has said, even before she was before she became the party chair. And I think that her views will be seen as acceptable to Beijing in many ways. She has embraced the 1992 consensus. She has even recently said some nice things about Putin, which maybe Xi Jinping would appreciate.
She said Putin was democratically elected, yes.
And not a dictator.
Yeah.
So I think that the Chinese will be interested in meeting with her. She appears to be eager to travel to Beijing, and my guess is they will receive her at fairly high levels. And then we will have to see whether there is more cooperation between the two, and that could be, of course, overt and could be covert. Yeah. Beijing is always trying to influence and shape developments inside Taiwan, and it has a lot of tools to do that. Sometimes even the KMT doesn't like Beijing's interference. This is, I think, something that we really do need to watch closely. Beijing, if it becomes more confident that the KMT could actually come back to power, might be something that would lead them to be less urgent about unification and perhaps put less pressure than on the United States. And it may buy some time, in a sense.
So you're saying if Beijing feels that KMT has the potential to govern Taiwan again, and given KMT's position that is more willing to have a dialogue or work with Beijing, that perhaps Beijing would put less pressure on the United States.
And on Taiwan.
And on Taiwan.
So ultimately, I think if the Chinese lose all hope in achieving unification through non-violent means, then they are more likely to move to a decision to use force. And so some people might say this is it's a bit of a silver lining. It may not be for other reasons, so I grant you that. I mean, there's a lot of domestic politics in Taiwan, but if the Chinese believe that the KMT is still a viable force, even if it doesn't win the next presidential election, that it's still a viable force within Taiwan, then I think they are more likely to be patient. Because at the end of the day, achieving unification through force, I believe, is not really in China's interest.
It's interesting because once, Zheng Li-wen was elected, we actually see a lot of congratulatory statements coming out of Xi Jinping directly, right? This was not the first time. I think he congratulated Eric Zhu as well. But the media was clearly, Chinese media, promoting this. And so, it could be interpreted as something certainly welcomed by Beijing because of Zheng Li-wen's positions. Since you also talk about all the possible scenarios in terms of how Beijing sees the possibility of KMT still being a force, what do you think over the next few years Beijing might do to ensure that that force, which advocates for openness, friendliness with Beijing, continues to grow? Or do you think Beijing will actually deploy more gray zone tactics?
To some extent, China's policies are tied to developments that happen in Taiwan and sometimes in the United States. It's not always true. But if the president of Taiwan says something in a speech that Beijing doesn't like, they certainly could use that as an excuse to conduct another major military exercise. I don't think the gray zone tactics are going to stop. China has gained a great deal by trying to demonstrate that Taiwan really doesn't have jurisdiction over its own waters and its own airspace, and it has gotten very close to particularly the outlying islands of Jinmen and Matsu, occasionally even going inside the 24 nautical miles around Taiwan. And so I think that they will continue to do that. So I don't think we will see any clear set of tactics in one direction. They have different tactics that they use at different purposes to achieve different objectives, and they send different messages to different audiences all the time. But you have people in Taiwan, and of course we have in the United States, that pay very close attention to all of these signals, and they're all important.
But it's interesting you said that Beijing usually, it sounds like it's more reactive to what Taipei and Washington, D.C. does. Or do you feel like Beijing actually proactively wants to use certain tactics to, almost like get some reactions or responses from Taipei and Washington?
I think it's both. I don't think it's exclusively reactive. China is trying to shape the environment around Taiwan. It is trying to change the status quo in its favor. We have seen lots of concrete examples of Chinese success in changing the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. And sometimes, as I said, they are using something that Taiwan has done as an excuse to push forward, further change the status quo. So no, they're not exclusively reactive.
Now, what would probably get Beijing most reactive includes deterrence, right, and increasing Taiwan's defense budget. And so I want to, talk a little bit about it, because the U.S. officials have been urging Taiwan to increase its defense budget to about 10% of GDP.
I've always said that Taiwan is very important to the United States, but as you said, it's not an existential interest. It's very important. The core American interest is in denying China regional hegemony. I think actually as a proportion of GDP, it's well below 3%. I agree with President Trump that they should be more like 10%, or at least something in that ballpark, really focused on their defense. So we need to properly incentivize them.
And President Lai has pledged to increase to 5% by 2030, and recently announced the T-Dome air defense system.
明年度我们的国防预算按照北约标准将超过 GDP 3%，并且也会在2030年前达到 GDP 5%，展现守护国家的决心。我们要达成3大目标：第一，加速打造台湾之盾 T-Dome。 建构台湾分层防御、高度感知、有效拦截的严密防空系统，为台湾编织保护国人生命财产安全的防护网。
Do you think this 5% to 10% gap can ever be closed, or that's just aspirational for the U.S.?
It's very difficult to know how the issue of Taiwan's defense spending affects the overall U.S.-Taiwan relationship. I can't put my finger on anything that would be something that the U.S. would say, you can only have this, or we will only do this for you after you spend 10% on GDP. I don't know if there's any specific thing like that, and I doubt it. I think it's just a constant drumbeat of, you need to do more for your defense, you need to spend more, you need to invest more. Apparently, when Secretary Hegseth was in the region recently, that was one of his major messages to the region. And the model was Europe is spending more on its defense. So you, Japan, and South Korea, you need to be spending more. So Taiwan really is in good company, although I think Taiwan is probably the only one where the United States has set this target of 10%. And I know that people in the administration get upset when other people say, oh, Taiwan can't spend that much. That's just not feasible. 5% would be a lot for Taiwan. So they don't want to hear that. So just like President Lai has come around to say 5% is something we're going to achieve. It's using NATO calculations, which are different, so it's a certain percentage on resilience, and I think it's probably 2.5% on actual weapons and 1.5% on resilience. So I would say Taiwan is moving in the right direction. Taiwan is taking its defense more seriously. It certainly is spending more in defense. It is conducting exercises that are much more realistic than it did in the past. So we should all agree the trajectory is right. And the question is just how far, how fast Taiwan can really move.
Yeah.
And hopefully the Trump administration appreciates all the good work that Taiwan is doing in this regard.
I think Taiwan is trying very hard.
I do too.
Well, thank you so much, Bonnie, for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you, and you're one of the most respected scholars in Washington, D.C. and Taiwan, as you know. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Wenchi.
Thank you for watching DC Insiders. Please follow us on social media to get the latest episode. See you next time.